Well, I just started my 18th year here on the faculty at Christian Theological Seminary. And for most of that time, I have served on the admissions committee. And so I suppose by now I've read hundreds, maybe even thousands of reference letters in support of applicants to our various degree programs. Sometimes these letters are real and honest assessments of the applicant's abilities, experience, and promise for ministry in church and community. Those are the letters I don't mind reading. Occasionally, though, we get letters that I like to call walking on water letters. You already know what I'm talking about. Such letters praise the applicant for breaking all the records in terms of academic performance, holding faith conviction so strong that the Apostle Paul would be impressed, outdoing even Mother Teresa in humility and works of charity. Now, clearly, these letters exaggerate, so I don't really like reading those letters. In my more honest moments, I secretly hope that I'll not have to spend much time with students or anyone else, for that matter, who walk on water. Even though I know that their virtues are exaggerated, such people cause me to be uneasy. I feel inferior, inadequate, sometimes deficient in some way. And so I prefer to hang out with people who are more pedestrian, more flawed, human, in other words. And so I wonder how many of you feel the same way. Our two scripture lessons this afternoon speak of trust. The first one, from the 3rd chapter of Proverbs, includes a resounding bit of advice: trust the Lord with all your heart and do not lean on your own understanding. It's good advice, very clear. We do not know everything. In fact, we don't know much at all. And so if our futures depend on us alone, we're in trouble. But if we trust in the Lord, all will be well. So far, so good. The New Testament lesson appears to say something close to the same thing, but makes this point through a beautifully vivid, overly familiar, and frankly terrifying story of Jesus and Peter walking on the water. As our gospel lesson opens, Jesus is on quite a roll. He's told parable after parable to help his disciples and those following him to know how to recognize the kingdom of heaven when they see it. It's like a sower. It's like a field of wheat and weeds growing together. It's like yeast that a woman works into a loaf of bread. It's like a mustard seed. And then comes one of the most well-known miracle stories in the Bible, the feeding of more than 5,000 people with just a few loaves and fishes. It's a story that was so important to the earliest followers of Jesus that all 4 canonical Gospels tell it, even if they differ in the details. Matthew tells it twice. And in today's text, Jesus walks on water, and Peter tries to follow. In some ways, it's not especially surprising that the author of Matthew would include this miracle story in his telling of the life and ministry of Jesus. The wisdom literature of the Hebrew Bible, especially the book of Job and the book of Psalms, often depicts God as having command of the seas in such a way that God can walk on water. In 2 different places, Job claims that mere mortals have no standing to contend with God because God alone, quote, stretched out the heavens and trampled on the waves of the sea. And recalling the exodus of Israel from Egypt, the psalmist praises God for walking over the sea without leaving any footprints. Isn't that a nice image? And so the idea of God walking on the water is one that is deeply rooted in the traditions of the Jewish people. And so when the author of Matthew includes this miracle story, there can be no mistaking it. The author is claiming that Jesus is God. All of those in the boat worshiped him, the author of Matthew writes. Surely you're the Son of God. But for a moment, let's turn our attention to the disciples in the boat, because after all, if we had been there, that's where we would have been. Jesus' disciples do not say, "Oh, there's Mary's son again walking on the water." No, miracles are terrifying things. Throughout the Gospels, those closest to Jesus, even though they experience miracles regularly, are almost always afraid when one happens. And that's certainly the case here. The text tells us when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified. "It's a ghost," they cried out in fear. But the disciples calm down when they recognize it's Jesus. "Take heart," he says, "it is I, do not be afraid." By the way, the Greek phrase here is ego eimi, and a more literal translation would be, "I am." That's the divine name revealed to Moses at the burning bush. I am who I am. I will be who I will be. Now, the original audience of Matthew's gospel, all of them probably pious Jews, would have picked up on the significance of this right away, even though we might miss it. Now, perhaps that would be miracle enough, but the story doesn't end there. Simon Peter, known in the gospel for his impetuousness, his impatience, leaps from the boat and tests both himself and Jesus. He challenges Jesus, and Jesus passes the test, but as we discover, Peter flunks. "Lord, if it's really you, not my imagination, bid me to come to you on the water," he says, and Jesus responds with a simple command, "Come." And so we all think we know what happened. Peter took his walk on the water, lost his nerve and sank, and then cried out to Jesus for help. And so Jesus immediately reaches out and catches him and says, "Oh, you have little faith. Why did you doubt?" And there you have it. If you trust God, you won't sink beneath the waves, but if you doubt, down you go. And on the surface, it appears that this miracle story is a parable about insufficient trust in God. But is it really about that? I wonder if there's something else going on here. Peter certainly experiences a loss of trust, a loss of confidence, and ultimately a loss of buoyancy. But what if the story is not about Peter losing his faith in Jesus? After all, would someone with no faith in Jesus cry out to him, "Lord, save me"? Who, in an instance of desperation, cries out to one in whom he has no trust? No, it's not a crisis of trust in Jesus that's being worked out here. It's a crisis of Peter's own confidence in himself. Peter wasn't thinking about walking on water. He wasn't planning to walk on water. He simply did not believe that he could finish what he started. And so, when Jesus says, "You have little faith, why did you doubt?" He's not asking, "Why did you have so little faith in me?" He's asking, "Why did you have so little faith in yourself? Why did you doubt that you couldn't finish what you started? I'm the one who called you." These texts and this sermon has our names written all over it. Some of you are ending day 3 of your journey here at Christian Theological Seminary, and I wonder if some of you are beginning to feel like you're sinking. Do I have what it takes to make it here or not? What am I doing here? I know, because it's not been all that long ago that I was in your shoes. New faculty colleagues have arrived, some freshly minted PhDs and new to the challenge of graduate theological education. If you are like I was nearly 20 years ago, sometimes you feel like you're sinking too. Do I have what it takes? Do I have anything meaningful to say? Imposter syndrome, they call it. And it's real. Even after more than 20 years of preaching, sometimes I stand behind the pulpit and wonder whether I have anything worthwhile to say at all. I wonder whether I have buoyancy, or am I going to sink like a stone? Lord, this one has to be yours because I don't have anything to say at all. Nothing. Our texts this morning speak directly to our situation. Proverbs tells us that we cannot, indeed we must not, try to do it all on our own, because trust only in self, self-confidence, self-sufficiency on their own comprise an egomaniacal, corrosive individualism that threatens to make neurotics out of all of us. Instead, Proverbs calls us to trust in God. Don't lean on your own understanding. But that's only half the story of faith. Our gospel lesson teaches us that faith also means that God enables us to do whatever God calls us to do. God does not ask us to do anything that God does not equip us to do. And so viewed in this light, faith looks more like an unswerving trust in a trustworthy God, yes, and a firm conviction that God enables us to do what God commands of us. Otherwise, we're all in trouble. So don't be afraid. It's God. It's not you. It's not the waves and the storm. It is I. Don't be afraid. I don't think it's too much to claim that faith in self is one expression of faith in God. Trust in self is one expression of trust in God. Wait just a minute, preacher. We thought you were a Calvinist. Human depravity and all of that. They're going to take away your membership card if you keep up this line of thinking. I know. I believe that faith is both a trust in God and in ourselves because, don't forget, God has made us in God's image. God has given us the gifts and graces for ministry, and if used on our own by ourselves, these gifts and graces are likely not to accomplish much at all. But if they're used with the help from both God and from one another, they enable us to accomplish great things, impossible things, things that we probably shouldn't even dare trying. Remember, in the account of Peter's walking on the water, he was not alone. He was not a solitary, heroic individual venturing forth all by himself, though that's how the text sometimes gets read. Remember, his friends were in the boat, and remember, he was headed toward Jesus, right? As long as he remained focused on Jesus, he could do whatever had to be done, including walking on the water. When he lost his focus and began to think about the possibility of failure rather than the responsibility of success, that's when he began to sink. And so it is with us right here at Christian Theological Seminary at the start of a new academic year. What we are doing is not all God's work. God's doing godly things while we sit back and wait. Nor is it all our work either, the triumph of solitary individuals or even a group of remarkable people. So when we're on the stormy seas and we're terrified, we must remember that we are not alone and we are not on our own. We must also realize that God empowers us to utilize our own skills, our powers, our graces, our talents, to get all of us together from this side to that, without anybody sinking. The fact is, God knows more about us than we know about God or even about ourselves. And so it's fair to say, I think, that God trusts us more than we trust ourselves. The great lesson of faith is to learn by experience of our own lives that we can, in fact, do what God calls us to do. When we doubt that we're able to do what God specifically enables us to do, that's when we begin to sink. That's when all we can do is cry out and say, Lord, save me. To realize that we really can do what God calls us to do, so long as we hope and trust in God and trust in ourselves. Friends, this is liberation. This is truly and fully to live into the calling that God has given to you. It's a matter of trust. Amen.